Tell me if this sounds familiar. When you read, you should read with a pen. Highlight, underline, take notes, then summarize what you've learned in a journal or on note cards. You've heard this, right? And for some books, it's good advice. If you're reading something like Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, this is a book about the science of sleep, and that kind of careful note-taking can help you keep track of all the information and really evaluate and remember what the author is saying. But if you're reading a book like, say, one of Tana French's crime novels, that same approach is probably just going to get in the way, because we read novels like this for the experience, for the suspense and the building up of the story. And if you keep stopping every few pages to take notes and turn the book into a little study guide, you may technically understand the plot better, but you're probably going to miss the whole point of reading that kind of book in the first place. So in this video, I want to talk about why good reading advice isn't always good and how that advice can ruin what would otherwise be a great book. And I want to start with books that are primarily meant to be experienced. This would be books like crime novels, thrillers, science fiction, literary fiction, plays, and even epic poems. The primary purpose of all of these books is to please rather than teach, and because of that, these kinds of books have to be read differently. And by the way, I should point out that when I say to please, I'm not necessarily talking about some kind of shallow or mindless entertainment. A good detective novel, for example, it gives you the pleasure of trying to solve a mystery or some kind of puzzle. So something like this can be intellectually stimulating, but still very enjoyable. Now, not all types of fiction should be read the same way either. Epic poems like the Odyssey or the Iliad, they tend to be more difficult because they're usually written in verse and they're much larger in scope. And because of this difficulty, you probably need to go through them a little bit carefully and a little bit more slowly. The other side of that, though, is that some novels are actually meant to be read through fairly quickly. Now, I have to be careful here because I am a huge advocate of slow reading. It's good for attention, it's good for comprehension, and it has a host of other cognitive benefits. But sometimes our ability to follow the plot of a novel, it depends on a certain level of momentum, and you need that momentum to sort of maintain an emotional connection to the characters and to the events of the story. And a good writer is going to be very deliberate and strategic about the pacing of their novels. Thrillers, for example, are meant to be read fairly quickly. That's part of the intended experience. So while I wouldn't advise anyone to speed read through a novel, you do still want to read through it with the pace that it was originally intended. And with some novels, that pace may be a lot faster than normal. With drama and plays like Shakespeare or even this adaptation of Mice and Men, we have to keep in mind that reading the script is only part of the experience because when the play was written, it was intended to be performed on a stage. So as a reader, it's your job to imagine things that normally wouldn't be required of you, such as the staging of the scene, the placement or the movement of the characters, even their tone of voice. The choices that are normally left up to the actors, all of those choices now fall to you and your imagination. Another way that reading advice can kind of ruin a great book is if you're reading a book that is primarily informational, like Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep. If you're reading that kind of book too passively, then in that case, you're probably not going to remember very much of it. And this is kind of the opposite problem because learning from that kind of book and being able to take that knowledge with you, that's kind of the whole point of reading a book that's primarily informational. And of course, this is why we have so much advice about highlighting and taking notes and so forth. Now, that makes sense, but that advice can also go too far. Some of the most well-known systems like the Zettelkasten or Cornell Notes or even Robert Greene's note card method, these are really useful if you're working on a research project or something like this. The problem is that they are also very time-consuming and labor-intensive, and they're also very prone to constant interruptions. And when you're spending most of your time and energy extracting and archiving all of this information, these systems start to compete with the actual reading of the book. Another problem I see, and this is especially true with Robert Greene's note card system, Most of the emphasis seems to be on collecting as many, cool sounding ideas or quotable ideas as possible, but they tend to de-emphasize exactly how a reader is supposed to discriminate between what's actually worth writing down and remembering and what isn't. I get this question all the time. How am I supposed to know what I'm supposed to write down? Telling readers to just focus on what they think is interesting or what sticks out, that's not very helpful, because at the end of the day, what the reader ends up with is just a collection of things that caught their attention rather than the actual value that the book is promising. And even worse, the reader walks away with this illusion that they've learned the main points that the author was trying to communicate to them. So for most informational books, I think the better approach is just keeping it super simple. Read for comprehension first. Then, at the end of the chapter, take a few minutes to just summarize it. And why summarize instead of writing down all these facts and bits of information that you found interesting? Because by doing so, you're automatically separating the main ideas and the examples and the evidence, the most relevant information from the book, from the least relevant information. And make no mistake, summarizing is a skill and you have to practice it, but it's a much better way of filtering and distilling informational books. When it comes to books that are primarily persuasive, one of the most common types is self-help or productivity books. Here I'm talking about books like Atomic Habits or The Mountain Is You. Now, I don't really read these kinds of books. In fact, the closest thing that I have is this book on flow and this book on how to read a book by Adler and Van Doren. But I think it's important to talk about these kinds of books because it seems to me that a lot of the advice about reading on the internet and even here on YouTube, it seems to be geared toward this kind of reading. Now, you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, these books are primarily instructional. And there is some truth to that. Self-help books or productivity books do have an element of instruction to them, but it's wrong to think that they are mostly or primarily instructional. A book whose purpose is primarily to inform, let's say this book about reading and the brain, this book's purpose is to communicate the latest science of reading from a cognitive perspective. And if it relays that information accurately, it has more or less served its purpose. And a self-help book might use some of that explanation, that's true. But it goes a step further by designing and then recommending a way that you should live or behave based on that information. This book, for example, although it's an excellent book and I think it contains a lot of great advice, its purpose is to convince readers that reading is a disciplined activity and that if you want to get the most from serious books, you need to approach them with more structure and effort. Now, that's a perspective, and although it's based on what the authors understand about reading comprehension, it's a very different message from a book that is primarily focused on communicating the science of reading. So the information might be there, but it's there only to serve the primary message about how the author wants you to change your thinking. And sometimes a large part of that persuasion is just trying to convince you that the goal is worth pursuing in the first place. For example, this book on flow, Csikszentmihalyi spends much of the time trying to convince you that this state of deep absorption is one of the most valuable experiences that a person can have, and that a good life should be built around finding more of it. And even if you already agree with the premise, it still has to convince you that this particular method of integrating flow experiences into your life is worth following. So with self-help books, it's really important for the reader to be skeptical on some level. At the very least, you need to be alert to rhetoric or emotional appeals or like cherry-picked examples, that kind of thing. And I don't mean to suggest that self-help authors are in general dishonest or that the advice is automatically wrong. That's not what I'm suggesting. But you should keep in mind that this is not simply an informational book, and your job is not simply to extract information from it. You're being asked to think and act in a specific way, and you should read these books with that awareness. So it's really important for readers to think about what kind of book they're reading, what its primary purpose is, and what you hope to get out of it. Reading with a pen and taking notes and all that, sure, that can help, but not always. And some books, to get the most out of them, you need to slow down a bit, while others are meant to be read a little faster. The level of attention, skepticism, the pace, none of that ever stays the same. The trick is knowing what kind of book you're reading and then being able to adjust so that you can get the most from it.